What's up, everybody? I hope y'all are having a wonderful day. I'm Anthony. On today's video, I have a super special one for y'all. Today, we're going to be doing a video that has literally taken me 9 months to finish. What am I talking about? Well, I decided to grow wheat for the first time, and I wanted to document every single thing I learned while doing it. So that's what today's video is going to be about. Everything I learned my first year growing wheat. That's right, today we're going to be talking about growing wheat for the first time. Now, if you pay attention to my channel, a couple months ago I did a video about thriving in whatever kind of scenario you may think about. Now, a lot of people like to grow their own gardens, and that's perfectly fine because I do as well, to be able to supplement your food bill. But what if you can't go to the grocery store? What if you needed to grow all your own food? Well, you're not going to really be able to survive a humongous crisis, or at least be able to thrive, without growing some form of grain. Because let's be honest here, the Aztecs, the Egyptians weren't building the pyramids by eating nothing but spinach and broccoli. No, they were being, fed corn, wheat, things like that. So if you're not paying attention to grain crops, it's something you absolutely have to consider, because that is what's going to put you to that next level. That is going to give you the strength and energy to be able to do everything you need to do around your property and store enough for next year. So last year when I was harvesting my garden, I was pulling off ears of corn because I grew a popcorn last year. I was doing a little test plot. I said, what if I really needed this for survival? How many calories could I get off of planting a giant amount of corn? In reality, I can get quite a bit, but I didn't want to just think about one grain only. I hadn't considered the fact that that's the only grain I've ever grown, aside from beans, of course. So I had to consider opening up my thought process and say, I need to try something else. I've seen people grow wheat out here, so I wanted to give it a shot. Now, one thing about wheat that you have to understand is there's about 4 different types, or 4 main types. You're going to come across a hard red, a hard white, or a soft red and a soft white wheat. One thing I did not know at the time that I know now is they work better in different geographical locations. For me at the time, what I did was I walked into my pantry, I pulled a couple of sacks of flour, and I read on the bottom what type of wheat was in there. Since I use a lot of bread flour because I make a lot of breads, it said a hard red wheat. So I said, bingo, boom, I gotta find a hard red wheat. So I went online to see what seeds I could find, and you'd be surprised at how hard it is, especially at certain times of year, to find seed for wheat, something that's not already been spoiled, something that can actually sprout. So I ended up finding a hard red wheat called red fife wheat. All right, got a couple packets of that, and I decided to plant them in one of my smaller plots, my 4x6 bed, to see if I could at least grow it in my climate. Now, when you're growing wheat in my climate, since it is so hot, you have to consider growing winter wheat and not a spring wheat. The 2 different types are basically the same seed, but it's when you plant it. If you're farther up north, like above the Mason-Dixon line, then you could probably get away with planting spring wheat. But if you live down south like me, where you have a mild winter, if you plant it in the spring, it is going to get just absolutely too hot and too windy, too wet, all kinds of crazy stuff by the time you need to harvest that wheat. So you have to plant it in the fall in hopes to harvest at very early summer. So that's what I ended up doing. So November 10th last year is when I decided to plant my seed. One of the things that I'd never really considered was having a seed drill or anything of the sort. So I just literally took a handful of seeds and threw them into the bed. Was that a mistake? I'll let y'all know a little bit. But what I did was I literally took a couple handfuls of seed and boom, 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 threw them into the bed to see what would happen. The reason I planted November 10th is because it's a date that I would remember. Why is that? If you're a Marine, you'll know. Now, in about a week, I started to see the fruits of my labor, because all of them that I threw down germinated. Looks like this. One thing I want to make sure I'm completely clear on is when I planted this wheat, I had no idea the different stages of wheat growth. I thought it was just like growing a regular vegetable, and in reality it is not. There are several different stages that the wheat has to hit for you to know which area you're in. Now, that first picture I showed you was right after it germinated, okay? So it was maybe this tall. Well, about a month later, we started to get to the tillering stage. Now, the tillering stage is when it starts sending off a few side shoots. It looks like this. Fortunately for me, the weather really didn't want to cooperate. Of course, this was the one year that we had a snowy winter. We don't get snow but once every 5 or 6 years. Well, this year we got snow. That kind of worried me, but it happened right at that end of tillering stage in about the middle to end of January. This is what it looked like. So it was kind of awkward that we got snow for the first time in 5 years, right as I'm trying a wheat growing experiment. I didn't know what was going to happen because, again, I've never grown wheat before, especially never growing winter wheat. So what ended up happening was I just ended up letting the snow melt, didn't dig it off or anything like that. I just wanted to see what would happen, to see if wheat even would survive. And guess what? It did. Wheat is extremely resilient. Now, by the end of February, about February 26th, I went from the tillering stage to the next stage of growth in wheat, and that is the the stem extension stage. That's where you get the tillering, the side leaves that shoot out. Well, now you have the extension that shoots up through the middle, where ultimately that seed head is going to form. Now, it was at this point where I had several monkey wrenches thrown at me at the same time because it was very warm by the end of February, early March. I'm talking about I was already getting into the 80s. Then all of a sudden, March 15th, we got a 22-degree night. Had a couple issues with my fruit trees. Didn't know if the wheat was going to make it. Wheat survived just fine. However, because we had that really cold plunge, that made thunderstorms really violent for the next 2 weeks. So unfortunately, I had massive amounts of wind that hit my wheat. Luckily enough for me, it was still in that stem extension phase, so the wind didn't bother it too bad. I had a couple stalks that decided to lay over, and I wasn't quite sure if that was going to survive. By the way, the technical term for laying down a wheat crop or any grain crop is called lodging. Keep that in your back pocket. So I had a couple, probably about half the bed was actually lodged, and I wasn't sure if the wheat was actually going to stand back up. Well, guess what? Over the course of the next 2 weeks, we had pretty good sun. We didn't have that much wind, and it self-corrected itself. So I was like, all right, obviously wind's not going to bother it. We should be good to go, right? Now, it was about the end of April that we hit the next stage of growth. We went from stem extension to the heading part. That's where you actually get the heads of the wheat seeds that actually come out of the plant. Now, this is the one thing that had me completely confused because I went out there one day and didn't see anything. I walked out literally the next day and saw like 4 or 5. And I was kind of, concerned, but I didn't know how it came about because I thought that what ended up happening was the wheat would shoot out the top like this. Not at all. This is one thing I wanted to teach y'all because I learned it from first-hand experience. The way it works is you have what's called a flag leaf that unravels. The actual wheat is grown inside the stalk, and the one leaf just unravels it, and that's where your head comes from, and that's what ends up shooting up. So I thought it was kind of nifty, kind of cool, so I wanted to show you what that looks like. Now it is at this point where we're going from heading to ripening because when it heads up, you're going to start seeing these little flowers pop out the sides. These little flowers, since they are self-fertile anyway, it doesn't really matter, but these little flowers are what's ultimately going to determine how much wheat seeds you actually get. This is what they look like. These flowers are going to stick around for a couple days before the next stage of ripening. When you get to ripening, that head is going to get taller and taller, and that's where you ultimately see the stereotypical, this is what wheat looks like. So it gets to the point of ripening, and that's when all you're basically doing is waiting for the plant to mature and then dry out. This is the part that hurt me the most because I had 2 things happen that absolutely killed me. Not only do we get more extremely violent thunderstorms, but we also had a lot more humidity and evening rains. When you get this kind of stuff in the southeast, this is when fungal issues start popping up, and unfortunately wheat is very susceptible to fungal issues. Now, this amount of wind when it's in that ending phase of the stem extension is not a good thing at all because lodging can be corrected if it's early enough. Well, if it's already getting to that point of height, it's not going to be corrected quite as easy. You're going to get a lot of laydown. And unfortunately, that's what I had because we had several storms that produced hail about this big, especially to the north of me. They were cracking windshields and wind gusts of about 50 to 60 miles an hour. Now, we get these things often, okay? It's not really that uncommon here. But again, I've never tried growing wheat before with this kind of weather issues. So that's what I was experimenting with, and that's what I experienced. And there's the drawback of wheat in the springtime in the south. Got a big old storm just blew through here, 40-mile-an-hour winds, 40, 50-mile-an-hour winds, and all of my wheat is now laying down. It's this point where I got lucky and unlucky, because I got unlucky in the fact that I had a couple massive storms come through, push over at least half of the wheat, pushed it down completely flat, so I lost half of it there. And then I got unlucky at the fact that all the humidity and all the evening rains that we were having increased the chances of fungal issues. Now, where I got lucky was it's at the very end stage, the last growing part of wheat. So all I was doing was ripening. But when you get things like rust here, so not only was the wheat just completely decimated by this last round of storms, but I think we have been given the death blow. Because look, all the humidity, all the rain, that's rust. And it's all over every single one of them. Heavy. So I was basically waiting for it to ripen before I could harvest. And I don't think we're going to get to that point, because I think the rust is getting to the kernels before we can get that full-on ripening stage. So looks like a lot of my hard work might have been all for naught. This can spell absolute disaster for your wheat in relatively short amount of time. I'm talking about like 8 hours. And ultimately that's what ended up happening. A lot of my wheat leaves developed rust like this. So at this point I was 8 months in. I'm not gonna give up now. I just decided to say, you know what, I'm gonna let it happen, see if I get any wheat. If I do, it's a bonus, but if not, I learned something new. And as fate would have it, guess what? Yeah, I lost a few heads, actually lost about half my bed, but I still was able to keep about half of what I planted. As of filming, it is the 1st of June, so I wanted to show you what I was dealing with in terms of what I have now, but basically I'm at the point where I'm letting the plant die off. Because you don't want to harvest until that entire stalk is yellow or dry. There's still a couple green spots on half the plant, so I'm letting them dry out for the 95-degree day that we're having today. It should not take very long, but the ones that were dry I went ahead and clipped, and that's what you saw in the intro. So I wanted to show you how much wheat I actually was able to get out of one seed head. That way you can determine if this is worth growing for yourself, because like I said, you only get so many seeds per head. Kind of one of those things you got to pay attention to. Now here's one of the most important parts of the video. What did I learn ultimately from my mistakes that I made my first year? Well, I realized that I made 4 crucial mistakes. Number 1, I grew the wrong variety. Remember when I said earlier I grew a red 5 wheat, a hard red wheat? Well, I've talked to several farmers since I started growing it, and I realized that is not the type that you grow down south at all. There's a reason for it, because it grows way too tall. So that's why I had a lot of lodging issues. Not to mention it is a different type of plant and it isn't able to deal with the humidity that we have or the storms. So that was the first thing I did incorrectly, was I grew the wrong type. What I should have been growing was a soft red wheat, or at least a soft white. But everyone around here grows soft red. That's something I should have done in the first place. The next mistake that I made was, instead of actually drilling and planting at proper spacing like I should have, I broadcast the seeds out like I said earlier. Well, what ended up happening was I ended up sowing the seeds too thick. When you sow that thick, you take nutrients from each plant. It doesn't grow as well, which is kind of why I had that little hollow in the middle, but it also increases the chance for lodging. Remember, lodging is when the wind knocks it over. So because I had sown it so thick, that ultimately increased the chances of lodging, which is why I had such a big issue with it. Now, another issue of sowing too thick is I also had no airflow. So when we did get wind to blow through and dry off the moisture on the leaves, because every morning we get dew here, when it's sown that thick, you don't get airflow. So if you get no airflow and you live in a humid environment like me, that's why rust went rampant. That's why I had so many issues like this. Because there was no airflow, rust was able to jump from plant to plant to plant within hours. And finally, I think one of my biggest mistakes, besides doing all of that, was the fact that I planted too late. I planted in November. I should have planted in October, because if I would have done it in October, I would have been out of the ground by 1st of May. When all these really hardcore storms started rolling through in May, I would have been already out of the ground, no problem. I wouldn't have the lodging issues that I had. But since I decided to plant at the same time as my garlic in November, that bit me hard. So there you have it. That is my first experience growing wheat on my property. How do you think I did? Did I make a lot of mistakes? Because yes, I know I sure did. But I was doing this blind because, again, a lot of people in this community have never grown wheat before. They read about it all the time and they tell you what they read out of the books. But until you actually experience it yourself, you're not really going to understand how things actually work. So that's why I ended up doing it like I did. I decided to take the metaphorical bull by the horns and say, I'm gonna go ahead and plant those so I can find all the problems out so you don't have to. That's what I hope this video did. I hope you learned a whole bunch, because I know I sure did. If you like this video at all, please do me a humongous favor and give me a thumbs up. It would absolutely help me out and I would very much appreciate it. Subscribe and I'll catch y'all later, okay?